Between Stalin's death and the coming to power of Nikita Khrushchev in 1953, relations between the Soviet Union and the United States thawed somewhat. In July 1959, an exhibition presenting the American way of life to the Soviet people opened in Moscow. We'll be exploring this unprecedented coming together of East and West through the eyes of one of the exhibition's American guides, a man by the name of Dan Slobin. Like many other amateur photographers, he established, without really meaning to, a record of his times. Using his photos, we reconstructed his journey and imagined his thoughts.
When I left my family in Detroit, my mother was so proud. "Dan, you're going to shake the president's hand." In the bus, conversations went on in Russian and English. I photographed the lucky few who'd been chosen on their way to Washington. There were 75 of us students in all, picked by the State Department from all the universities in the country. June 30th, 1959. A camera flashes. Then President Eisenhower says, "There have never been so many people speaking Russian in the White House before." The president smilingly takes my hand. How proud I feel. Eisenhower isn't losing sight of the purpose of our mission. He tells us, "Never forget, in the Soviet Union, you'll be ambassadors of the United States." Dan Slobin, Amerikansky. The receptionist is quite surprised that I speak Russian. We're all being put up at the Ostankino, a modern hotel far from the center of Moscow. Agents of the State Department have briefed us that the building will be bugged. Barely have we been shown to our rooms than we are on all fours looking for the bugs. I go out, armed with my old Kodak and my Super 8 Cine camera. I promised my grandmother I'd bring back some images of Moscow, but how will she recognize a city she hasn't seen since the revolution? I buy a makovka, a poppy seed bun. It tastes the same as those I eat at home. All the warnings we were given before leaving seem inappropriate now. Yes, maybe I should be wary of the Soviet Union, but not of these Russian people who are so like me. Attention, work in progress. That's the least you can say. The site of the exhibition to be is an enormous construction site. The ultra-modern pavilions I'd imagined are far from being finished. The dome conceived by the architect, Buckminster Fuller, is starting to take shape in the center of the site. Further along, George Nelson has designed an incredible roof construction in the shape of flower petals. The White House hasn't skimped. The idea is clearly to impress the Soviets.
A month earlier in New York, President Eisenhower had opened an exhibition conceived by the USSR. In order to impress the Americans, the Soviets had paraded their rockets and satellites. At the time, they were in the lead in the space race. Faced with a Sputnik, the United States decided to show off their way of life. U.S. soft power against the Soviet demonstration of force. Two conceptions of the world clashing in a merciless PR war.
I filmed the construction site and wonder how it will ever be ready for the opening in a week's time. Bob McCune, the personnel director at the exhibition, has the answer. "America needs you. I hope you like manual labor." Surprise! The workers, bricklayers, and bulldozer drivers are women. They let me photograph them, but don't want to talk to me. And the men? Well, they're just sitting around. It has to be said that it is around 30 degrees. When I ask them how to help them, they reply, "Rabota zavtra," work tomorrow. They laugh at me. For all that I speak their language, I remain in their eyes an American.
Eisenhower gave his vice president, Richard Nixon, the job of ensuring the success of the exhibition. A budget of $3.5 million had been allocated for the building of spectacular pavilions. For the rest, the White House had turned to the private sector. The industrialists picked up the bill, all united in their wish to sell the American dream.
July 23rd. Dear all. We got here a week ago, and I've certainly been kept busy. This damn construction has at least one thing going for it. It's creating a sense of solidarity among the guides. More than half of the 75 are female students, and over half of them are very pretty. Do the maths. Tanya, for example, immortalized here as she cooked at the site. But Maria, too. My heart is torn between the blonde and the brunette. I also have to mention George. Unlike most of the guides, there's nothing Russian in his ancestry. He learned the language at Harvard, where he's studying history. But he's as modest as he is bright. We're great friends already. Only 24 hours before the opening, and the cement of the main concourse still isn't dry. George takes my photograph at the entrance. Just think, Nixon will be in the same spot tomorrow.
The atmosphere was tense when Vice President Richard Nixon and his wife arrived for the official opening. A few days previously in Washington, senators had passed a resolution calling for a week of prayer on behalf of the people reduced to slavery behind the Iron Curtain. In response, the Soviets increased the rumors attacking this exhibition, fearing its impact on the Russians who visited it. A genuine entente still seemed out of reach, yet, faced with the threat of nuclear apocalypse, the two superpowers had to get on.
In view of the destructive power of modern weapons, we know that if there's another war, there will be no victors, only losers. Because for the first time since the dawn of civilization, we have reached the point where we must either learn to live together or we will die together.
I have to admit that I'm nervous, as are all the guides. The girls are practicing forming a guard of honor. Among them are my two friends, Tanya the blonde and Maria the brunette. In a few minutes, Khrushchev will be joining Nixon for the opening. I heard that he's been in a temper since that stupid resolution by Congress. All afternoon I've been hearing the Soviet and American national anthems being rehearsed. After all the political tension of last week, can this exhibition restore some sort of harmony between the two countries?
On this 24th of July, 1959, Nixon and Khrushchev opened the exhibition. During the visit, the tension mounted. While being shown around the model American kitchen, Khrushchev sarcastically asked Nixon whether the machine that pushes food into the mouths of Americans had been perfected yet. The vice president took it without reacting. Eisenhower had given Nixon one instruction: not to lose his cool when provoked by the communist leader. In front of the cameras, Khrushchev compared the Soviet standard of living to that of the Americans and promised he'd give the latter a wave when the USSR overtook them.
On July 25th at 9 o'clock on the dot, the exhibition opened its doors to the public. Crowds of Russians now throng the alleys. All of a sudden, faced with all these visitors, I feel weak. They're bursting with enthusiasm to see and touch everything. I'm working on the supermarket stand. Here's a photo of me in action. The first thing I'm asked is, "Are you selling these goods?" "No," I answer with a smile. "It's an exhibition." And I hand over a leaflet explaining how an American supermarket works. For the Russians, the idea of just loading up a shopping trolley with everything you want is too good to be true. I photographed the trolley an hour after the opening. The only thing the American government hadn't foreseen was the possibility of the visitors stealing the demonstration frozen dishes.
I'm Marie Wynn. I was born in Czechoslovakia, but I've lived almost all my life in America.
My friend Maria is interviewed by American television. Behind that smile lies a tough character. Maria lives in Maine. Like all the guides, she's American, but her second homeland is the country her family came from. Hers is Czechoslovakia. Mine is Russia. I dream of the Iron Curtain at least melting a bit, even if it won't fall. Maria is not optimistic. On my break, I go and see George at the automobile stand. He's answering the most surprising questions patiently and informatively. Like me, George thinks the exhibition has the potential to change mentalities on both sides. I photograph these Russians confronting their dreams. One of them says to me, "The ultimate stage of communism will have been reached when every citizen has an apartment and a car. All you need is to believe."
By the evening of July 25th, there had been 50,000 visitors, quite a triumph for the first day. Not for the Soviet authorities, though, who weren't having the same sort of success with their exhibition in New York. Pravda launched a smear campaign, and Russian propaganda who was talking about a society in which millions of unemployed had no bread to eat. The Soviets also took aim at America's Achilles heel, racial segregation. To unsettle the Americans, agitators were sent to the exhibition.
August 5th. Dear all, this is a fascinating experience, but also a testing one. For the last week, all the guides have been confronted at least once a day with aggressive visitors. They try to turn the crowds against us by bombarding us with political questions. Tanya was heckled by the guy on the left of this photo, leaving her quite shocked. As for my friend Maria, when she was asked, "If the workers in your country live so well, why do they go on strike so often?" She replied, "Because in my country they have that right." A good answer, but poor diplomacy. I'm spending more time filming Maria than Moscow. She's trying to educate me politically. Like my grandmother, she thinks communists are always hiding bad intentions. Yesterday, we went to Red Square to visit Lenin's tomb. I was surprised to see that he's still revered by the Russians. I was even more surprised to see, in the vault next to Lenin, the embalmed body of Stalin. The jokes here speak volumes more than official pronouncements. Why are there more visitors to the mausoleum since Stalin joined Lenin? To make sure he is really dead. After being open a month, the exhibition has now had over 2 million visitors. Despite state propaganda, the exhibition is still just as popular. And the visitors always put the same questions to the guides. Are all these products really available in America? They find it hard to believe. On the car stand, George's knowledge is sorely tested. The Russians seem to know a lot more about cylinders and carburetors than he does. Between a couple of visitors, George confides in me that he's just met a marvelous girl by the name of Tatiana, a Russian. I tell him to be careful. When you meet her, you'll understand. George says, I'm going to see her at the Polaroid stand. There's something magical about these instant photographs, which the Russians like. Everything right now, just like in America. As far as I'm concerned, whether it's capitalist or communist, photography is above all a memory factory. When Tatiana's face appears on the Polaroid photo, I feel I understand why he's smitten. I look at George, so brimming with confidence, and I'm convinced nothing can stop this coming together of East and West.
On August 15th, just before the end of his visit to the USSR, Vice President Nixon caused a sensation when the White House invited Khrushchev to the United States. The Soviet newspapers welcomed this American initiative. It would be the first official visit to the USA by a Soviet leader. The trip was planned for September. The first aim of the exhibition was being realized: détente.
Since the announcement of Khrushchev's visit to the United States, the atmosphere at the exhibition has completely changed. The provocations have stopped, and it's now all miri druzhba, peace and friendship. The visitors are fully indulging their enthusiasm for all things American. I love the surprised or disgusted faces of the Russians on my photos. One man asks me naively, "Does this strange drink get you drunk?" George and Tatiana see each other every day. They're not even being secretive about it, seeming to believe their passion is stronger than borders and ideologies. I so hope they are right. This afternoon I've been helping out on the IBM stand. The visitors question the computer and it prints out an answer. I'm quite happy in this job. I'm still being bombarded with questions, but this time it's the machine that's answering. One visitor asks, "What is the definition of this music that the Americans call rock and roll?" A rumor spreads around the stands that Jimmy Matisov, one of the guides, has been caught with a Russian prostitute in some bushes. The diplomatic incident everyone has been dreading could now break out over some petty episode of sexual dalliance.
The young guide managed to take refuge in the American embassy in Moscow. The Americans, suspecting that the Russian secret services had engineered this scandal, did all they could to hush it up. The embassy managed to sneak the guide back to the United States.
The following day, we're all called before Bob McCune. He's furious. "Do you realize that you're representing the United States?" George is in despair. He's been officially forbidden to see Tatiana. They just decided to get married. George is despondent, staying alone in the hotel. Maria and I take in the sights of Moscow. She looks even prettier than usual. I load my cine camera with my last roll of film. In front of St. Basil's Cathedral, Maria talks politics with a painter who sells his works to the tourists. He asks her, "What's the difference between capitalism and communism?" It's easy. Capitalism is the exploitation of man by man, whereas communism is the complete opposite. Maria is shocked by this cynicism, but I'm not. The Russian sense of humor is their armor. A bit further along, in front of a synagogue, some men approach us. Some of them have cousins in the United States. Speaking to them, I'm reminded of my Jewish, Russian, and American roots, and I think of my grandmother back there in Detroit. Once the exhibition is over, I want to visit Uman, the town of her birth, and take a few photos as I promised her. That is, if the American State Department and Soviet authorities allow it. September 4th. Dear all, this last day has been rather joyous. I feel as though a barrier between the Russians and us has come down. In the end, it was the freedom of our exchanges more than the things exhibited which helped change mentalities. I took my last photos before the exhibition closed. Then the exhibition director thanked us all on behalf of President Eisenhower. America has been able to reach millions of Russians in a direct way, and Khrushchev has been invited for an official visit. For once, there are no victors or losers. This evening, to celebrate, the guides danced to the sound of Russian jazz. Well, all except for poor George. After a few vodkas, Maria finally stops talking politics. In the taxi taking us back to the hotel, I lean in towards her. The driver shyly interrupts us. He says he would like our two peoples to help and understand each other better, like when they were allies during the last war. He seems sincere. The next day, autumn has arrived for the farewells. Maria promises to call me in Detroit, and I promise to go and see her in Maine, but neither of us really believes it. George tries to console Tatiana. For him, as for me, the whole thing seems like a mirage. Happily, I have my memories and my photos.
Following the exhibition, Khrushchev's trip to the United States was a success. But this fragile détente was fractured in May 1960 when an American U-2 spy plane was shot down by the Soviets. Its pilot, Gary Powers, was put on trial in Moscow. Following this diplomatic incident, the building of the Berlin Wall and the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis really sealed the breakdown in relations. Despite efforts to turn things around, the summer of 1959 was just a short-lived thaw in the Cold War. Back in the United States, Dan Slobin completed his studies and became a psychology professor at Berkeley University. In 1969, his friend George Pfeiffer finally managed to marry Tatiana.